Did you know that there are 6 facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus that almost all New Testament scholars agree on, whether Christian or non Christian? And if you take into consideration all these facts, then the only conclusion to come to that makes sense of all of them is that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. Now, the first fact is that Jesus died by crucifixion under the authority of Pontius Pilate. This is not only widely attested by all the gospel writers, but even well known non Christian historians like Josephus and Tacitus attest to this as well. So, given the multiple early Christian and non Christian sources that attest this aspect of Jesus, this is about as historically certain as it gets. And this is why critical scholar Bart Ehrman says that the most certain element of the tradition about Jesus is that he was crucified on the orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now, some will object to this and say that Jesus didn't actually die, but that he survived the crucifixion, and this gave the disciples the impression that he rose from the dead. There are a few problems with this. For one, Roman crucifixion is one of the harshest and most brutal forms of torture and execution. No one is just simply going to walk away from that. Also, the Romans were professional executioners. They would have made sure that Jesus actually died. And this is exactly what they did when they pierced his side, as recorded in John, and blood and water came out, which was a known sign that the person was indeed dead. Also, if the disciples saw Jesus all mangled and half dead from the crucifixion, they would have said that he did not rise from the dead and conquered death, but that he had just somehow survived the crucifixion, which Jesus would have said was what happened if that was the case. So this objection doesn't really hold any water. The second fact is that the disciples believed to have seen Jesus bodily after he had been killed. Not only do the Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John attest to this, but Paul reports in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, that Jesus appeared to his disciples after being raised from the dead. So we have multiple early sources attesting to this idea that Jesus appeared alive after he died to his disciples. Now, some will object to this and say that maybe they just saw a hallucination and it appeared that Jesus resurrected, but actually he didn't. But this doesn't really work for multiple reasons. For one, the Gospels describe Jesus showing his scars of the crucifixion and the disciples touching him and even eating with him. So if this was a hallucination, it would be really hard to touch and eat with a hallucination. The other problem is that a hallucination is a private experience. Other people can't see what you're hallucinating. Even if every one of the disciples were hallucinating, they wouldn't have all seen the same thing, and if they did, then that would be a miracle in itself. And in that creed that Paul recites in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that over 500 people saw the risen Jesus as well, so they would have seen the same hallucination, which is highly unlikely given what we know about hallucinations. The third fact is that due to these experiences that the disciples believed they had, they became bold in their preaching and were willing to suffer persecution, even die for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. This fact shows that they were at least genuine in their belief that Jesus rose from the dead, because they went from being described in the Gospels as scared and confused when Jesus was killed, and then after they claimed to have seen that Jesus rose from the dead, they were boldly preaching the resurrection of Jesus and were severely persecuted, and some were even killed for this belief, as reported in not only the book of Acts, but also in Josephus and Clement of Rome. Now, some would say that they were just lying about seeing the resurrected Jesus in order to save face after following who they thought was the Messiah, in order to keep the movement going so they didn't look stupid. However, no one suffers and dies for something they know isn't true. And if they were lying, then they would have said that they were lying instead of suffering and dying for something they knew was a lie. Again, no one dies for something they know is a lie. Also, we don't have any evidence that the disciples ever recanted their belief in the resurrection amid all their persecution and eventual deaths for some. Given that, it seems to me that, and to many scholars, that the disciples were at least sincere in their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. The fourth fact is that this proclamation of Jesus' resurrection was early, and that church creed that I referred to from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, many scholars date that creed was received by Paul to originate in Jerusalem within 3 to 5 years after Jesus' death. So the belief that Jesus died and rose from the dead was believed and proclaimed early and wasn't something built up over time. Also, all of the New Testament is generally agreed to be written in the first century, and there is unanimous attestation that Jesus rose from the dead amongst these first century documents. So this wasn't a legendary account that built up over the course of hundreds of years, but something that was proclaimed early and within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. The fifth fact is that James, who was an unbeliever in Jesus, later was converted due to his belief in seeing the risen Jesus and eventually died for this belief. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus' family is very skeptical of Jesus, and they even describe him as a madman. Now, Paul recorded in that early church creed and from 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus also appeared to James. James would later seem to be a leader in the Jerusalem church in Acts chapter 15, and then James was eventually martyred by the high priest in Jerusalem at that time, as recorded by Josephus. So something had to have caused this radical change of behavior from James, which would be that he genuinely believed to have seen the risen Jesus. The sixth fact is that Paul, who like James was a skeptic of Jesus, later converted due to his belief in seeing the risen Jesus. Paul in Acts, as well as in his own admission in his letters to the Galatians and the Philippians, attests to the fact that he was a persecutor of the early church and was even killing Christians. But then in Acts and in Galatians, they say that the risen Jesus appeared to him. Not only this, but Paul also lists himself in the 1 Corinthians 15 early church creed that Jesus appeared to him as well. After this appearance, he went on to be the main preacher of the gospel to the Gentiles and would eventually write about half the New Testament. He would also go on to suffer harsh persecution for his belief in the resurrection of Jesus, as he attests in his second letter to the Corinthians, and Eusebius says he eventually dies in Rome during Nero's reign, while Nero was killing a large number of Christians. So Paul went from persecuting Christians to being persecuted, eventually being killed for his belief in seeing the risen Christ. So, just like James, something had to have caused this radical change of behavior from Paul, which would be that he genuinely believed to have seen the risen Jesus. Now, you could say James and Paul were lying, but seeing that they were previous skeptics and had nothing to gain from believing in the resurrection of Jesus and would eventually die for this belief, it is very unlikely that they were lying, but that, as I said before, they were sincere in the belief of seeing the risen Jesus. So given all these facts that Christians and non-Christian scholars generally agree on, which are that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and then after his death, his disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus, the disciples then were transformed from fearful panic to boldly preaching his resurrection, and were willing to die for their beliefs, and that this proclamation of his resurrection was the central message of the church, starting very early and not decades later, as well as Jesus' unbelieving brother, James, was converted by what he believed was appearance of the risen Jesus, and finally Paul, a former persecutor of Christians, was converted by what he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. The only conclusion to come to that makes sense of all these facts is that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. No other natural explanation can account for all these, but if you have one, feel free to let me know. But if you're being honest, Jesus rising from the dead is the only and best explanation to account for all of these facts.